over. The Chinese ambassador to the UK has been summoned to the Foreign Office following the arrest of a BBC journalist in Shanghai. Ed Lawrence was beaten and kicked by police before being held for several hours. Chinese officials claim he was detained as a precaution against being infected with COVID by demonstrators who were protesting against lockdown laws. We're joined now by Associate Professor of Chinese Politics at the University of Toronto, Diana Fu. Professor Fu, thank you very much for joining us here on BBC News. What in particular strikes you about these protests?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I think as a scholar of Chinese politics, there's two features of these protests that I find to be quite remarkable. And the first one is scale. The fact that these protests are breaking out in multiple cities across China and also outside of China is fairly unusual. One of the last times that protests of this scale have broken out was all the way back in 2012 when there were anti-Japanese protests. But this time the people are angry at their own government and not at the Japanese government. And so this scale of protest is quite unusual, and it has actually escalated to across the world, including in Toronto, where I am based. And the second feature that I find quite remarkable is actually the rhetoric and messaging. So Chinese protesters are shouting, "We don't want masks, we want freedom, we need human rights, we need freedom." And these slogans might seem quite commonplace in countries like in liberal democracies, where people often invoke the frames of freedom. But this kind of language is actually truly unusual in China because freedom, citizenship, rights, all of these things are considered to be extremely politically sensitive. Ordinary protesters normally stay away from this kind of language because they understand that it's like playing with fire. But not this time. What we're seeing this time is that protesters are demanding not just livelihood rights, but they're holding up blank pieces of paper to symbolize that they also want political rights. And so I see this as kind of a political awakening, especially among youth, that they want to be able to speak their minds and voice their grievances, and they don't want just survival.
How much of a threat are these demonstrations to the government in that they challenge that social contract between states and the public?
Yeah, I think these protests are a threat to the CCP insofar as they do in fact challenge a social contract between the state and citizens. And that social contract that has been in place for a while is one in which the government promises to provide basic livelihood rights like housing, food, security to people in exchange for the consent to be ruled. And in the beginning of the pandemic, as Chinese people were watching the death tolls mount in Europe, in North America, and other, especially Western liberal democracies, I think they felt that this social contract was quite reasonable. I mean, sure, they had limitations to political rights, but they were used to that, and they felt that at least they're alive. But I think what we're seeing now is that people, or at least some Chinese protesters, have reached a breaking point where they feel like the government is no longer holding up its end of the bargain in terms of fulfilling the social contract, with 20 estimates of 20% youth unemployment, businesses closing, migrant workers left homeless, and preventable deaths that are mounting. What we are seeing is that some Chinese citizens are beginning to withdraw their consent to be ruled in this way. And to the extent that this has rippling effects, this is quite threatening to the party's legitimacy.
I suppose the question that everybody would love to know the answer to is, are these protests likely to grow or dissipate? And if they do dissipate, will it be because the government has offered some concessions?
Yes, that is indeed the question that everyone is asking, but it's one that is very hard to answer, and I would not like to make any predictions about that. However, the protests, yes, on the one hand, they may very well ripple into other regions in China, but they may also dissipate if the government makes some concessions, such as easing COVID restrictions, and they do so quickly. Because I think, like any other government, the Chinese government is very aware that concessions are sometimes necessary to quell mass unrest. They are also aware that at the height of protests, when people are most angry, most passionate, that it can be very costly to mount repression, because those can backfire on the state. And so we really should be watching for any signs of concessions made by local governments in the coming weeks and months.
Professor Diana Fu from the University of Toronto, thank you very much for talking to us.